As you see a 9-9, Olga Korbut's won a gold medal. There it is.
5 seconds left in the game. Do you believe in miracles? Yes! Unbelievable.
Hello, I'm Vince Hunt and welcome to our podcast series, Sports in the Cold War. So far, we've looked at more than 20 important themes in Cold War sports history, with plenty more to come. Why not follow the series on Twitter with the hashtag Cold War Sports, or rate and review the shows on iTunes, or drop Laura Deal an email at the Wilson Centre with your thoughts. Organised athletic events in Asia were underway at a regional level from before the turn of the 20th century, set up by missionaries and Christian groups like the YMCA, and formalised as the Far Eastern Championship Games between 1913 and 1934. After peace returned to the Pacific region with the end of World War II, the Asian Games were founded, opening in Delhi in 1951 and characterised as a symbol of peaceful Asian cooperation at a time of Cold War tensions and sometimes violent de-colonization. Well, Stefan Huebner is an expert on colonialism, development policy and sport in Asia. He's a research fellow at the National University of Singapore and the author of a book, Pan-Asian Sport and the Emergence of Modern Asia from 1913 to 74. Stefan, did it take long for the Asian region to reorganise for sport after World War II? I imagine that region must have been quite badly dislocated.
Well, if we compare the Asian region to the Olympic Games, then it took longer to reorganize. I mean, the Olympic Games, for example, took place again after about 3 years in 1948 in London, whereas in the case of Asia, it took longer. But this is not necessarily because of the war, but it is also an outcome of the problems that Indian organizers had. They had initially no stadium, even though they were supposed to host games, and building a stadium, cost some time. So in the end, this delayed the process. But the plans emerged really early, already during the last months of the Second World War, to recreate some sort of Asian or Far Eastern Championship Games.
And who was it that was driving that resumption of sporting relations?
Well, I already mentioned the Indians. They were very important, but we also had the Chinese nationalists, not the communists, and also Filipinos. This is maybe a bit surprising if one doesn't know the backstory, because, as you said, in 1913, the Far Eastern Championship Games had been founded in Manila, which was at this point in time the capital of the Philippines, colony of the United States. And this was done by the YMCA. So this was one outcome of American colonial policy and had quite strong impact on Philippine society. So the Filipinos were, during the 1910s, 1920s, a very strong sports power, one can say, in Asia. And a lot of Filipinos had been trained by the YMCA and other groups in American colleges, universities as professional physical educators. So these people were very experienced. We also have the Japanese as a very influential group, but because of the defeat in the Second World War, as one might expect, they didn't really play a big role, except that they tried to get back into the Olympic movement. And the Chinese, as mentioned, also were very influential initially until the Civil War really became problematic, because they too had been inspired by the YMCA and other groups. So they actually were the country that should have hosted the very first Asian Games, but because most of the organizers eventually fled to Taiwan and some others to Hong Kong, this was not possible. It was then Indians who had also been inspired by the YMCA to take over the burden or the honor of organizing the first Asian Games.
And what kind of sports were there that featured? Give me some of the highlights of that Games.
It might be surprising, but there were no Asian sports, or those sports one would consider Asian sports, like judo, for example, wushu, and other sports, martial arts, and so on. But these sports did not take place, but only Western sports that were inspired by the YMCA and the International Olympic Games. And this was also to a certain degree because one needed sports in which all Asian countries could participate, and if possible in which no specific country would have significantly more experience than the other countries, so that everybody had a reasonable chance to win a medal. But the most important sports, actually, in Guru Dutsondi's opinion, he was the most influential Indian organizer, was swimming and track and field, because these sports were low-cost sports. And it was very important for him to host low-cost sports because of the poverty in many Asian countries.
What was the reaction to it? Was it positive? Was it seen as a triumph of human spirit?
Well, for the organizers and for the politicians, it was a symbol of Asia's reunification, the beginning of de-colonization, Asia growing together again. Jawaharlal Nehru, for example, the Indian prime minister, who already during the interwar period had made certain pan-Asian claims, was also very convinced that this was a very positive event, like, for example, the Asian Relations Conference that had taken place in 1947, and later on the Bandung Conference in Indonesia in 1955, the Asia-Africa Conference, as it is also called. So this is also one outcome of this Asian reunification process, in which quite a lot of politicians believed. When we talk about normal people, I'm not really sure if they knew that these games took place. At least when we talk about people not living in India, because I read in several newspapers that the media campaign was relatively poorly done. I mean, in India, newspapers report on the games. This was also the case in other countries, but all in all, media attention in many countries seems not to have been caught. At least this was an accusation by several Indian newspapers.
That the press coverage wasn't enough.
Yeah, this is something that happened during several games, because, I mean, in these days we did not have television, or at least not available to Asian consumers. We had some radio broadcasting, but affording a radio, yes, in Japan, sure, many people had radios by then. But in many other countries, people were limited to newspapers, and even newspapers were not easily accessible.
So the cycle of the games goes New Delhi in 1951, in the Philippines in 1954, and then, extraordinary to think, really, in Japan in 1958. And that's only 13 years after Japan's had atomic bombs dropped on it.
And this is also, it's 6 years before the Olympic Games took place in Japan, so we still had an atmosphere that was to a certain degree characterized by limited anti-Japanese feelings. For example, when we talk about the games you just mentioned in the Philippines in 1954, when the Japanese entered the stadium in Manila, all the people started to insult them. This was more or less a reaction to the Japanese occupation of the Philippines, and they shouted all sorts of Japanese words they had learned, like thief and other words. So this was quite problematic, I would say. But at the end of the games, it was said that the situation had changed a bit, and people had become used to the Japanese presence again.
But the Asian Games here are an example of bridge building through sport, aren't they?
Yeah, this was at least the initial aim. People were aware that sports events sometimes could increase tensions if many people meet, but all in all, the amateur spirit, also heritage of the Olympic Games, or the early Olympic spirit, and also of the YMCA, still existed, and people believed that internationalism and egalitarianism, and also to a certain degree, something like a capitalist work ethic, could be inspired among people through sports. So all in all, a means to create a better world, so to speak. This is at least what the YMCA had in mind, obviously from an American Protestant perspective, but nevertheless a positive or benevolent intention, even though it was implemented sometimes in a very paternalistic way.
At the same time, as well as this post-World War II bridge building, there's also a period of de-colonization, as well as the Cold War shaping this particular region. So it must have been tremendously confusing trying to plot any particular outcomes for any of these countries. Was there a tendency for newly independent nations to vent anti-imperialist, anti-colonial sentiments at these games? Did it become, for example, an international platform like the Olympics did for protest?
Yes, I mean, I first want to say something on the host countries. When we talk about India, for example, in 51, we have a leading country of what would later become the non-aligned movement. Then we have the Philippines in 1954, pro-American ally. Seattle, for example. Then we have the Japanese in 58, also very pro-American, not necessarily voluntarily, but because of the Cold War situation, this was necessary. And then in 1962, we have Indonesia. Sukarno's Indonesia, also one of the leading countries of the non-aligned movement. Afterwards, Thailand, 2 times, 1966 and 70 again, American ally, actually the most important American ally during the Vietnam War. And then the last event I focus on were the games in 74 in Iran, also relatively pro-American. But the most dramatic incidents took place in 1962 in Sukarno's Indonesia. This was games that were really inspired by anti-colonialism, anti-neocolonialism, anti-imperialism, and so on. He gave quite a lot of speeches on these topics, which was also inspired to a certain degree by the CIA's attempt to, basically to topple his government some years earlier. So he felt not necessarily threatened by the Dutch, but by the Americans, even though he did not break up relations with them. But the Dutch, for example, also mattered a bit because they were quarreling with Indonesia over control over some remaining colonies in West Papua, and all this had an impact on the rhetoric of the games. So this was not necessarily between colonizers and colonized or former colonized on the ashtray, but really about the rhetoric around the games, the Pan-Asian rhetoric. We meet here as Asians to show to the world that we are competent in hosting such games, that we are able to build giant hotels, that we are able to build giant sports stadiums that are as good as the stadiums in other parts of the world. We are not worse than the West. We are not worse than the Eastern Bloc. We are competent now after decolonization, after this period of darkness is over. Our new golden age is beginning now.
And where does the Vietnam War fit into this Cold War period?
When we talk about the games in Thailand in 1966 and in 1970, we have a situation that was very much influenced by the Vietnam War. We have attempts on the side of the Thai government to increase tourism. There were already quite a lot of American soldiers coming to Thailand, especially to Bangkok for recreation purposes, mostly visiting prostitutes and so on. We know these stories. But there were also more and more Japanese who were becoming rich and therefore could do overseas trips. So hosting, for example, the Asian Games or the Southeast Asian Games or trade fairs and so on served to increase the tourism trade of the Thais. And quite a lot of hotels were built, for example, during 1966, inspired by the Asian Games, by a big trade fair and other events. So this had an impact. But when we talk about, for example, funding problems, in 1970, the Vietnam War also had an obvious impact. The Thais actually didn't have the money to host the games because they had to spend so much money on their military. Nevertheless, it was possible to host the games. Strictly speaking, they were not supposed to host the 1970 games. The Koreans were supposed, or the South Koreans were supposed to host these games, but they too had a money problem because they were very much threatened by North Korea and therefore couldn't focus on hosting the games, had to give up the idea, and then the Thais took over, got a lot of Japanese money, Korean money, and then were able eventually with this money to host the games.
Were the Asian Games a pathway to eventual stability in the region, a region of shifting and complex post-war allegiances? How much of today's sporting landscape can be attributed to their success?
Well, this is difficult to answer because when we talk, for example, the exclusion of Israel, we have to wonder if this is actually something positive or something negative. it contributed to the stability of the games, yes, but it's obviously a sign that quite a lot of influential countries, for example, the Arab countries, could enforce their own perception of Asia, and Israel is no part of Asia or of the Middle East. So Israel eventually was forced to work together with a lot of European federations. And over the course of time, we also had the exclusion of, or de facto exclusion of several countries. The Indonesians, for example, excluded Taiwan and also, again, Israel. And we also had the absence of communist countries for quite a while. But eventually, from, one can say, the late 70s onward, after Israel was excluded, things did not lead to significant, or we did not see significant problems anymore. Some of the former Soviet republics eventually joined the games, and there are limited or some mild tensions between East Asia and the Arab world. This is about funding and influence, but this is all in all no factor that resulted in the breakdown of the games. In contrast, for example, to the breakdown of the Far Eastern Championship games during the 1930s. So yes, I would say all in all it resulted in a stabilization of the region.
You've been listening to a podcast from the series Key Moments in Cold War Sports History, a project bringing together experts from around the world and hosted here on the Wilson Centre's online digital archive at digitalarchive.org. These podcasts are part of the project The Global History of Sport in the Cold War, which is sponsored by the National Endowment of the Humanities, directed by Professor Bob Edelman of UC San Diego, Professor Chris Young from the University of Cambridge, and Dr. Christian Ostermann of the Woodrow Wilson Centre, and run in collaboration with the German Historical Institute Moscow, the Jordan Centre for Advanced Russian Studies at New York University, and Pembroke College, University of Cambridge. The presenter is Vince Hunt, and the series is produced by Vince Hunt and Laura Deal.